From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
And we're back with more strange news, potentially another whiff by the Biden administration. This one a little lower profile, but the ramifications could be equally as distressing as what's happening over there in Afghanistan. Probably seen a lot in the news lately, or at least on social media, more so on social media, I would say, even than in the news, that fentanyl, the synthetic opioid, has really been wreaking havoc on people, causing tens of thousands of overdose deaths a year. In your local communities or in your local scenes or whatever, you may have started to see people posting screenshots or image macros or whatever talking about street drugs being laced with fentanyl. Which, as we know, we've talked about it before, especially in our big pharma episode and about Purdue Pharma in particular, how little fentanyl it takes to cause a deadly overdose. It's like there's images online where you can see a penny and then you can see some crumbs of fentanyl next to it. And it's literally like 1 or 2 milligrams that can cause you to absolutely drop dead. And
it has a lot to do with what type of fentanyl it is, because there's so many different cousins, like chemical cousins.
Thank you, Matt. That's a big part of what today's story is about as well. It's sort of a 2-tiered story. But so again, with those, shares that you might be seeing on Instagram about, it's about looking out for your friends. If you know any addicts or you know any users, I mean, plenty of people do, and you don't have to be an addict to be a drug user, but cocaine, MDMA, things like that, there is a lot of concern about these street drugs that are laced with this potentially deadly substance that can cause an instant overdose if just by, insufflating, I believe is the word for snorting, or injecting just a few grains, not grams, mind you, grains. And so there's a lot of information or call to action on making sure you get this overdose deterrent called Narcan, which is it's like a little inhaler, and you can literally save someone's life. It's apparently very, very, very powerful and relatively easy to get. You can get them at pharmacies. There are places that are passing them out for free and teaching classes on how to use them. So it's a lot of the stuff that I've been seeing is about being prepared and watching out for your friends and maybe carrying one of these around with you. But the story for today is about a bit of a PR, let's say, misstep that the San Diego Police Department did. Because yes, while we know this substance is very, very dangerous, it is still possible to fearmonger about it in ways that could actually do more damage than create positive outcomes. And this is, I think, what is happening with this story out of San Diego. Essentially, what the San Diego Police Department did was they released a video, which essentially, it almost looks like you're watching a news package. You've got stand-ups from these different officers. But you have this body cam footage of a young officer handling something, evidence of some kind during a traffic stop in a trunk, and then all of a sudden, passing out, just literally keeling over on his back. Then you have this very heroic footage of the body cam, the perspective shot of his partner unpacking one of these Narcan inhalers from the blister pack and then administering it to his buddy. Then he's loaded onto a gurney, and it's almost literally one of those sitting up with the 2 thumbs up. It's like, thanks for saving me, pal. And then it's got stand-ups, talking heads of the officer, his partner, and I believe one other representative of the San Diego Police Department. But the officer unequivocally says, I overdosed, and his partner is saying, and his eyes rolled into the back of his head, he was clearly overdosing all the way to the hospital. And they released this, and the news ran it as fact, the local news. There's several examples of this being picked up and just run as fact, because amidst this kind of climate of fear that I'm talking about, a very real fear that should be real around this substance. It's the kind of thing where, of course, you're going to not question this. You're going to run it. You're going to be like, oh my God, it can kill you just by touching it, just by looking at it, And so then we have some folks in the medical community coming out and saying, well, actually, this isn't true at all. You cannot overdose simply by touching the substance. It's just not biologically possible, is what the experts are saying. So let's go to the experts real quick.
Before we do that, I just want to say this is really surprising to me, and I think I fell victim to some of the stories coming out about fentanyl and officers coming into contact with it. Not this particular one, but in the past, other stories about an officer encountering fentanyl and getting it on them and then needing Narcan just in case. And I think we even talked about it before.
I think we did too, Matt. I think we did too.
Wow.
And here's the thing. They never released any toxicology. The young man didn't die. The dude didn't die. But they never actually confirmed that it was an overdose with the hospital. And the sheriff of the San Diego Police Department admitted that he himself, not a doctor, is the one who put this out to the public that it was an overdose. And again, this video really is what you would call a public service announcement type video, or almost like it's meant to educate, but unfortunately it's just laced, no pun intended, with misinformation. And these experts they were talking about, one of which is a woman named Gretchen Bergman, who's the executive director and co-founder of an organization called A New Path. That's an organization that's trying to reduce the stigma associated with drug abuse and addiction. And she said, it just didn't feel right. It didn't sound right. He had gloves on, but even if he had gotten it on his skin, he would have had to take his hand to his mouth or nose. It doesn't seep into your pores. And this is backed up by numerous other medical professionals in various sources that we read, or that I read for this. And, it's just interesting because the idea of stigmatizing drug users is something that's always kind of gone hand in hand with like the quote unquote war on drugs. And, the idea of mandatory minimums and treating drug users as criminals rather than people that are in need of counseling or, mental health issues, right? Or suffering from mental health issues. And that's something that Biden, as part of his campaign, was very much about. He's got a son that famously struggled with drug addiction. But apparently, he has also quietly done expanded legislation that does just that, imposes mandatory minimums, not on fentanyl itself, but on what's called fentanyl analogs. And Matt, you hit the nail on the head at the top of the segment. You were talking about how many different flavors and styles, some flavors is I'm joking, but different like slight variations on the molecule that is fentanyl that can be considered fentanyl analogs. And some of them are way, way, way stronger, and some of them are completely innocuous. Some of them are a little weaker. But through this thing called class-wide scheduling, they are all treated the same. And it essentially amounts to, I read a really great article on the Marshall Project, amounts to a similar treatment to what was done with crack cocaine in the 1980s versus powder cocaine. Essentially what was done with crack was treated much more harshly in terms of possession because it was seen as this epidemic, but it was also, I think we could probably all agree, seen as a way to harass and jail and mess with members of minority communities. Because if there's more crack in minority communities and more powder cocaine in affluent communities, well, you're more likely to get longer, harsher sentences in minority communities. And, you could argue the causation of that, but it seems to me like it was done pretty consciously. And the same thing is true with this. When we're talking about drugs laced with fentanyl, they can be laced with either fentanyl, proper fentanyl, like you would get prescribed, from a doctor, which it is used. It's a Schedule II drug, which means that it has high instances of addiction, but also that it is, a drug that can be used to treat. It has like legitimate use to treat conditions like cancer and pain from cancer. But the analogs, Matt, are actually receiving harsher penalties. So it requires a much smaller amount of a fentanyl analog to be found, say, laced inside of a batch of cocaine that someone's selling than actual fentanyl itself. And the argument is that this is being done in a similar way, targeting minority communities. What do you think?
This is what I would say. Very recently, we started a show called Psychoactive with host Ethan Nadelman, who founded the Drug Policy Alliance. And was it last week? No, it was on August 5th. We released an episode all about this, specifically about analogs of fentanyl and what fentanyl is and why there were more overdoses last year than there were more deaths from overdose than car accidents, gun shootings, drownings, and a couple other things combined. And just like, why? How is that happening, right? And it was all about this specific thing, all of these different analogs, because some of them, at least from that interview and to my understanding, it has to do with the strength. Sometimes these analogs are 10 times more strong than regular fentanyl, which is already like 40 times more strong than heroin.
Mm-hmm.
Then some of them are not as strong, but it's very difficult to know what you're dealing with, especially if you're on the user level. You have no idea, right? Unless the person whoever your dealer is a legit chemist who's making the stuff, who can describe it perfectly to you and you can understand it perfectly. It's a dangerous situation, and I can see why maybe law enforcement would want to punish the use of this stuff much, much more, because it is causing so much death, no matter who you are, where you are.
But why treat the analog more harshly than the substance itself?
Well, it's hard. It's hard. I can't recall this interview completely from Psychoactive, but one of the major points is that the year's supply of fentanyl that comes from outside of the U.S., if you imagine the shipping in of drugs, there's all kinds of creative and weird ways that cartels and other people do to get stuff in, right?
Yeah, well, but also to reduce the weight and like have more strength with less weight.
Well, I'm not going to say it correctly. You have to listen to that interview to get it. But the actual physical amount of fentanyl that is in circulation in the United States in any given year is very, very tiny. It was like two small, whatever the units were, two tiny amounts. Because, and just talking about how difficult it is to police that, right? If you imagine a smuggling operation, when it's an analog, I think I don't know. I really don't know. I'm imagining if they're finding that it's being produced statewide somewhere, in some labs. This is all speculation on my part because I have no idea. I have no idea why they would treat the analogs that differently besides the huge variance in effect.
No, I'm totally with you. And I think legislation that would target the manufacturers and the folks that are actually bringing this in makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, what this legislation does is it punishes the street level dealers without really, having much in place to find the root cause. Maybe that's just because it's too difficult because it is such a small amount. But like there's an article about this dude Todd Coleman who got sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for selling 30 grams of cocaine. And the reason for that is because the crime lab found that it was laced with 3 illegal fentanyl analogs. One was benzyl fentanyl. And in fact, they were incorrect. The crime lab made a mistake. None of the compounds were a fentanyl analog. 2 of them weren't even controlled substances. But the point is, like, if they found this fentanyl analog, it is a harsher penalty than actual fentanyl. And that doesn't matter if it's one of the molecules or one of the variations that is absolutely innocuous, or if it's something like carfentanil, which is like I think 10,000 times stronger than morphine. So it's just interesting, and I'm not trying to be alarmist. And I mean, the Marshall Project is a nonprofit journalism organization that deals with criminal justice stuff, and possibly is has an agenda. But I do think it's interesting that it the way you can look at it similar to like crack versus cocaine.
Look, here's the rough thing for me, man. Somebody I loved, somebody that was a fan of this show, was really close to me. Got sold by some street level dealer cocaine that had fentanyl in it, and he died. And if I could find that person, I would. I'm not going to say it. I would love for that person to be in prison so that I can't get to them. What I'm saying is, I understand why law enforcement has that view of like this somebody selling fentanyl laced anything should go away. but it won't ever stop the problem because someone will always be there to fill the position if person A goes to prison, right? So it's a terrible situation. I don't know. I don't even know how to put it, man. It really is terrible. If there's injustice and it needs to be taken care of. It's just the substance itself is so dangerous.
It is, but it's also. Well, let's also talk about the fact that many of these analogs, it's all a game that these like black market labs are playing to keep from being prosecuted. Because if you change a molecule of something and make it something that's not technically scheduled, then you are in fact shirking the law a little bit. But again, devil's advocate here. I'm just trying to look at both sides. So there's the crack cocaine analogy, but then there's also like, well, if you pre-schedule all fentanyl analogs, even ones that haven't been invented yet, then you are potentially lowering the incentive for higher level manufacturers and dealers to lace their stuff with it in the first place. So that could be seen as a positive version of this. But I also don't understand why there's so many other things to lace your drugs with. Why would you lace your drugs with something that will literally kill your customers? I've never understood that.
You just need so very little, right? Per whatever you're selling, per dose, per use. So, I mean, I think that's why it's, I don't know. I'm not an expert, but it certainly seems like that's why, because it's very, very strong and you need very, very little. So let's just say you could have pretty terrible cocaine, but a little bit of fentanyl goes a long way in that case.
I guess that's true, but it's also like, I mean, fentanyl is a depressant and cocaine is a stimulant. Anyone that thinks, oh my gosh, this cocaine is great because a little bit of fentanyl is in it, probably doesn't know what the effects of cocaine feel like.
Yeah, sure. Like me. But,
I'm
still,
just saying.
but same with heroin, same with whatever else people are buying and using. It's just, yeah. Ugh.
It's gross. And just to wrap it up with a statistic, 60% of drug overdoses last year could be attributed to fentanyl. And I bet you this year, because of the pandemic and because of maybe it has to do with interruptions in supply chains too, Matt, and things like that. And just feeling like, or someone even pointed out, maybe they're just trying to put another addictive substance into something to make you more addicted to it, even if you don't clock the difference in the effects. You know what I mean? So that could be part of it too. There's a lot of reasons, and these are evil people and absolutely should be put away. But just something to consider. But
at the same time, it's that it's not. Yeah, it's weird, man. It's weird because it's all just humans trying to experiment and get through something. I don't know. There's so many. It's so complicated. Right? The use of drugs, the selling of drugs, why you would maybe feel like you need to do that. Why some people do need to do that. Why governments take advantage of that. Why, corrupt police departments take advantage of that. Why cartels form and hold power. It's just, ugh. God, I really don't like drugs. Sorry, guys. I promise I'm not some narc or police officer. I've just experienced some negative things in my life associated with them. So it literally, you go ahead and do the bingo thing because I just don't like it.